The sun scorched the earth until the soil cracked and the air shimmered like fire. In the vast silence of the frontier, water was worth more than silver, and every drop was guarded with desperate care. Yet when a weary stranger stumbled into his land, lips split from thirst, the farmer did not hesitate. He drew from his own well, offered a tin cup, and watched the man drink as though the water itself was life reborn. It was an act so simple, so ordinary, that no one would have thought it worthy of remembrance. But in the West, where kindness was rarer than rain, even the smallest gesture could ignite the greatest of storms. That night, the farmer lay restless, wondering if he had been a fool. Neighbors would have called him reckless for sharing his most precious resource with a man he did not know. Water was survival, and survival was not something to gamble on trust. Yet something in the stranger's eyes had silenced the doubt in his chest. It was not gratitude the man carried, but something deeper, an unspoken weight that hinted at stories untold. By dawn, the farmer's land stirred with movement unlike any he had seen. From the edge of the plains, riders emerged, silent and solemn, their faces painted with the colors of tradition. An entire tribe, proud and fierce, rode toward his homestead. His heart tightened with fear, for in those days, such encounters often ended in fire and blood. But instead of war cries, they came with words of honor. The stranger he had given water to was no wanderer. He was one of their own. In front of his modest cabin, the tribe's chief dismounted, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. He spoke not of payment, nor of vengeance, but of protection. The farmer had shown compassion in a land that had long forgotten it, and for that, the tribe vowed to shield his home, his fields, and his kin from any hand that sought to harm him. With a single cup of water, the farmer had unknowingly forged a bond stronger than fences or rifles. From that day forward, the quiet man who once tilled his fields in solitude found himself at the center of a story the West would not soon forget. His well, once just a source of survival, had become the beginning of an alliance, one built not on contracts or coins, but on humanity's oldest truth, that kindness, even in the harshest land, can shape destiny. The farmer had always lived on the edge of hardship. His land was not generous, his well not deep, and every harvest was a gamble between life and ruin. He rose each morning before the sun, his hands calloused and his back bent from years of toil, not because he expected wealth, but because he had no other choice. In the West, survival was its own form of victory. That was why his act of giving water to the stranger had been so striking. It had not come from abundance, but from a heart that still refused to be hardened by scarcity. When the tribe pledged him protection, he could hardly believe it. For generations, settlers and tribes had eyed one another with suspicion, too often crossing paths only through conflict. Yet here stood proud warriors promising to defend him, not because of treaties or fear, but because of one act of compassion. To the farmer, it felt like a dream too fragile to last. He wondered if it was merely courtesy, a gesture to be forgotten as quickly as it had been spoken. But the very next night, when shadows crept across his field and rustlers sought to steal his cattle, the truth revealed itself. From the darkness came riders, silent, swift, and fierce. The rustlers fled before steel even met flesh, vanishing into the plains as though chased by ghosts. The farmer watched from his porch, heart pounding, as the tribe returned his cattle and saluted him with quiet nods. He had been spared loss not by his own rifle, but by the promise of those he had unknowingly bound himself to. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, realizing that a single cup of water had altered his life forever. Days passed, and the relationship grew in ways neither side expected. The farmer's children, shy and curious, played among the tribe's campfires, learning songs and stories older than the hills. His wife, cautious at first, found herself welcomed by women who shared recipes, remedies, and laughter. The farmer himself, though still bewildered, learned to see the riders not as strangers, but as neighbors. For the first time since settling on the land, he felt a sense of safety he had never known. Yet in the distance, whispers stirred. Other settlers, hardened by prejudice and fear, began to murmur against him. They said he had betrayed his kind, that no good could come from trusting those who had once been enemies. The farmer heard their words in the saloon, saw their suspicion in the markets, but he held fast. He knew what they did not. That trust, once earned, was stronger than any fence or rifle. The bond between the farmer and the tribe deepened with each season. He learned that the man he had given water to was no ordinary wanderer, but the son of the chief, a warrior who had nearly perished on a scouting journey. His survival was more than personal. It was vital to the tribe's future. To them, the farmer's kindness was not a simple gesture, but the saving of bloodline and legacy. And so their vow of protection was not fleeting gratitude. It was a sacred debt. Together, they built something rare in the Old West: harmony. When drought struck, they dug deeper wells side by side. When storms flattened fences and barns, they raised them again, working as one. The farmer, once a man of solitude, found his voice among the tribe, and they found in him a reminder that not all settlers came with greed in their hearts. Around campfires, he listened to tales of ancestors, of wars fought and peace sought, and he began to see the land not just as soil to till, but as something living, something worth protecting together. But peace is never without its shadows. Word of their alliance spread quickly, and where some settlers saw inspiration, others saw betrayal. Armed groups began to threaten the farmer, warning him that he had placed his faith in the wrong people. They muttered that one day the tribe would turn on him, that he was blind to their true nature. Fear bred anger, and anger sought violence. The farmer, though resolute, felt the weight of their suspicion pressing on his shoulders like a storm waiting to break. One evening, as dusk settled over the prairie, a mob rode to his land, intent on driving him out. They claimed his home was no longer that of a settler, but a foothold for outsiders. Their shouts cut through the night, demanding he step away from the alliance or pay the price. The farmer stood on his porch, rifle in hand, his heart steady but his chances grim. Alone, he knew he would not last the night. But he was not alone. Before the mob could advance, shadows moved across the ridge. Riders appeared one by one, their silhouettes painted by the moonlight. The tribe had come, not in anger, but in unyielding silence. They lined the fields, their presence a wall stronger than any fence. The mob, seeing they were outnumbered, faltered, then turned tail into the darkness. For the farmer, it was no longer a question of whether the tribe's promise was real. It was now undeniable truth. In giving water, he had gained a bond unbroken even by bloodshed. The mob's retreat did not end the whispers. If anything, it gave them new fuel. In nearby towns, the farmer's name was spoken with disdain, his generosity twisted into accusations of betrayal. Some called him a fool blinded by naivety. Others went as far as to label him a traitor to his own kind. The farmer felt the sting of those words, but what struck him harder was the coldness that followed. Merchants began refusing his trade, and neighbors who once greeted him with nods now turned away. Isolation wrapped around him like a noose. Yet he endured, because he knew the truth. A bond forged in compassion was worth more than the hollow approval of men ruled by fear. The tribe, seeing the weight upon his shoulders, tightened their circle of protection. They did not merely guard his home from violence. They shared in his burdens. Hunters brought him game when his field struggled. Healers tended to his family when illness crept in, and their warriors walked beside his children on the long road to school. In return, the farmer offered what little he could: part his harvest, space by his well, and above all, his trust. Slowly, what had begun as protection grew into something deeper, a kinship that blurred the lines of blood and heritage. But peace in the West is always fragile, and soon a greater test loomed. A band of marauders, hardened by years of raiding homesteads, caught word of the unusual alliance. To them, the farmer's land was more than a target. It was a symbol. If they could shatter the unity between settler and tribe, they could spread fear far beyond one valley. And so, under the cover of night, they descended with fire and fury, determined to raze everything to the ground. The first flames rose in the farmer's barn, lighting the night sky with orange fury. He rushed into the yard, rifle in hand, but before despair could take him, the thunder of hooves filled the air. The tribe was already there, swift as the wind, meeting the raiders head-on. What followed was chaos. The clash of steel, the roar of gunfire, the screams of men both falling and defiant. The farmer fought alongside them, no longer a man shielded, but a man standing shoulder to shoulder with those who had become his brothers. When dawn came, the raiders were gone, scattered across the plains. Smoke still rose from broken wood, but the farmhouse still stood, and so did the family within it. The tribe had kept their vow once more, but this time, the farmer realized something greater. They had not done it because of debt or duty. They had done it because he was now one of them. The battle against the marauders etched a new chapter into the valley story. Word spread quickly, not just of violence, but of resilience. Settlers who once mocked the farmer now whispered of his survival with awe, some even wondering aloud if perhaps they had misjudged him. To live through a raid of such scale was rare enough, but to emerge with both home and family intact was near miraculous. And behind every retelling was the same truth. The farmer had not stood alone. In the weeks that followed, the bond between farmer and tribe grew even more unbreakable. They shared meals, traded skills, and worked side by side as though the line between them had never existed. Around campfires, the farmer's children learned the rhythms of drums and the weight of stories older than the soil they walked upon. In return, he taught the tribe's younger ones the art of planting rows, the patience of tending fields. Together, they stitched a tapestry of life where fear had once dictated separation. But the greater world beyond their valley was not blind. Regional authorities, alarmed by the growing strength of this unlikely alliance, began to see it as a threat. A settler bound to a tribe by loyalty, rather than fear or power, challenged the fragile balance they sought to maintain. And so they began to plan. They whispered promises of protection to nearby homesteads, urging them to distance themselves from the farmer. They spread rumors that the tribe was using him, biding their time until they would claim his land as their own. The farmer felt the tension growing like storm clouds on the horizon. Yet he did not waver. Each day he rose with the dawn, walked his fields, and greeted his allies with the same steady nod. For him, there was no question. He had chosen trust, and he would not betray it, no matter how loud the world outside shouted. Still, the weight of what loomed ahead was clear. The day would come when words alone would not be enough to hold back the tide. And as he lay awake one night, listening to the soft breaths of his family and the distant hum of tribal drums, he understood the truth that had been shaping all along. The West was not about surviving alone. It was about enduring together. And though trials still waited in the shadows, he knew that as long as he kept his well open, as long as he offered water instead of turning away, there would always be hands ready to lift him when he stumbled. The seasons shifted, and with them, the farmer's land began to heal. Where fire had once scarred the fields, green shoots broke through the ash, stubborn and alive. The tribe stood with him in the planting, their laughter weaving into the rhythm of work. Side by side, they sowed seeds not only into the soil, but into a future that felt shared, no longer divided by bloodlines or suspicion. For the farmer, the sight of his children running freely among the tribe's young ones felt like a promise fulfilled, that the harsh West had not managed to kill hope after all. But not everyone welcomed such hope. For neighboring towns came more voices, bitter and suspicious. Preachers warned that the farmer's alliance was a betrayal of civilized men. Merchants whispered that he was a fool, blinded by sentiment, who would one day regret opening his well. And ranchers with hungry eyes began to circle his land, convinced that his bond with the tribe would eventually falter, leaving his homestead ripe for the taking. Each whisper was like a snake slithering through the grass, unseen but dangerous. The farmer heard these words when he ventured into town, their sting sharp as any blade. Yet every time doubt threatened to creep into his heart, he remembered the night the tribe had defended his family, the days they had carried food when his own fields failed, the steady presence of riders who patrolled his borders without asking for anything in return. He knew these bonds were real, forged in fire and sacrifice, stronger than any words of men who had never stood at his side in danger. The tribe, too, sensed the rising hostility beyond the valley. Their chief spoke to the farmer with quiet resolve. The West tests those who choose kindness. Many fear what they do not understand, but fear cannot uproot trust once it has grown. Those words lingered in the farmer's heart like scripture, giving him strength to rise each morning and continue his work, even as rumors thickened around him. Yet all could feel a larger storm brewing. It was no longer just neighbors or merchants who resented the alliance. It was men of power, those who ruled through fear, whose control depended on keeping settler and tribe divided. And such men would not remain silent forever. The storm revealed itself one summer, when soldiers rode into the valley under the banner of authority. They carried papers stamped with seals, declaring that the farmer's land was no longer his own. They claimed he had forfeited it by consorting with hostiles, and that for the safety of the region, he and his family must leave at once. Their voices were cold, their eyes calculating, not protectors of peace, but enforcers of control. The farmer stood on his porch, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. His wife clutched the children close, their faces pale with fear. For a moment, the weight of the soldier's words nearly crushed him. The law was not on his side, and neither was the power of the gun. All he had was the truth of his heart and the vow of those who had chosen to stand with him. And so, instead of answering, he simply looked toward the horizon. From the ridge came the sound of hooves, steady as a drumbeat. The tribe rode down, not in fury, but in silence, their presence filling the valley like a rising tide. They flanked the farmer's land, eyes sharp, spears and rifles gleaming in the sunlight. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. If the farmer was forced to leave, they would not let it be by intimidation or theft. The standoff stretched like taut wire. The soldiers, though armed, saw in the faces before them something they could not break, a unity born not of law or fear, but of loyalty. One wrong move would ignite a war, and they knew it. After tense minutes that felt like hours, the commander spat into the dirt, signaled his men, and withdrew. Their papers carried weight in towns and courts, but here in the valley, they carried none. That night, the farmer sat by his well, staring at the reflection of the moon in the water. His heart was heavy with the knowledge that peace would never come without trials, yet it was also lightened by a deeper truth. No matter how many storms descended, he was no longer alone. The West could threaten him with fire, steel, and law, but as long as trust remained unbroken, his home would endure. The clash with the soldiers became a tale that traveled far beyond the valley. In nearby towns, it was whispered that one farmer and one tribe had stood against the weight of authority and had not bent. Some spoke of it with admiration, others with contempt, but none could deny the power of what had taken place. For the farmer, however, it was not about legend or defiance. It was about survival, about keeping his family safe, and about honoring the bond that had been sealed with a single cup of water. As the seasons passed, he and the tribe continued to weave their lives together. They built shared storehouses to withstand lean times, hunted across the plains as one, and defended the valley not as separate peoples, but as kin. The children of the farmer and the tribe grew side by side, learning each other's languages, carrying both songs and stories in their hearts. In their laughter, the old boundaries began to fade, replaced by a new way of living that neither side had thought possible. But every step forward drew eyes sharper and colder. Rival settlers resented that the farmers' fields thrived under the watch of warriors, while their own lands remained vulnerable. Some envied the strength of his alliances, others feared it. They muttered in taverns that he had been chosen for favor, while the rest were left to fend for themselves. And as envy grew, so did their willingness to see him fall. The frontier had little patience for those who thrived differently. The farmer felt the weight of their envy, but did not let it break him. He rose each morning with the same routine, tending his crops, sharing his meals, and walking the fields with the same quiet dignity that had defined him from the start. Yet even in his calm, he sensed a gathering storm, something greater than gossip, something sharper than envy. For the West was a place where bitterness never stayed as words for long. And sure enough, that bitterness hardened into a plan. Rumors carried to the valley that a coalition of hostile men, fueled by fear and greed, was preparing to march. They did not come as soldiers under the law, but as vigilantes who believed themselves righteous. To them, the farmers' alliance was a threat to the order of things, and they would see it broken with fire if nothing else. The night before the attack, the farmer sat by his well in silence. The water glistened under the moonlight, a reminder of how all of this had begun, with one act of kindness, one simple choice to give when it would have been easier to withhold. He thought of how far that moment had carried him, how it had brought warriors to his side, saved his family from raiders, and built a community where there had once been only solitude. And as fear clawed at his chest, he clung to the memory of that first choice. When dawn broke, the sound of hooves and boots thundered through the valley. Dozens of men approached, armed with rifles, torches, and anger sharpened into conviction. They shouted accusations, calling him a traitor, demanding he abandon his ties with the tribe and leave his land. Their voices cracked like whips, but the farmer did not move. Behind him, his family stood, pale but unyielding, and around them, one by one, riders emerged. The tribe had come, not as protectors bound by debt, but as brothers and sisters bound by choice. The vigilantes, expecting an easy conquest, faltered at the sight. The farmer did not raise his rifle, nor did the chief lift his spear. Instead, they stood together, unmoving, their silence heavier than any threat. For a long moment, the air hung thick with tension. The vigilantes muttered, fingers twitching on triggers, but beneath their bravado was hesitation. They saw in that unity something they could not understand and would never break. One hot-headed man stepped forward, torch in hand, but the chief's horse shifted into his path, blocking him with quiet defiance. The man froze, his torch trembling. Around him, the others began to waver. Fear gnawed at their anger, fear not of violence, but of the strength they sensed in people who had chosen to stand as one. Slowly, voices fell silent, torches lowered, and the crowd began to scatter. What had come to be a massacre dissolved into nothing but the sound of retreating footsteps. When the last of the vigilantes disappeared into the horizon, the farmer exhaled for the first time. His hand shook, but his spirit did not. He looked at his family, then at the tribe, and understood something with a clarity that struck deeper than any fear. He was no longer just a man with land to till. He was part of something larger, something unbreakable. In the West, where survival often meant standing alone, he had discovered the rarest truth of all. That true strength was found in standing together. The retreat of the vigilantes marked more than just the end of a threat. It was a turning point. The farmer's land, once a solitary homestead on the edge of the wild, became a symbol whispered across the plains. Word spread of a settler who had not only lived in peace with the tribe, but had stood unshaken when outnumbered and outgunned. Some twisted the story into legend, claiming the farmer possessed magic, or that the well itself carried sacred water. Others, closer to the truth, spoke simply of a man who had given when others would have withheld, and in doing so, gained something no amount of gold could buy. As the seasons passed, the alliance flourished. Traders passing through found the valley safer than any town patrolled by lawmen, for no raider dared test the bond between the farmer and his allies. Families weary of constant bloodshed began settling nearby, hopeful that some of the peace might extend to them. Slowly, the valley changed. Where there had been only one farmhouse and one tribe's camp, now there were gardens, corrals, and children's laughter ringing across shared fields. The farmer's well no longer served just his family. It became the heart of a community. Yet with growth came new challenges. The farmer understood that unity was fragile, like glass that could crack under the weight of greed. He saw newcomers bring with them the same fears that had once driven men to raise torches against him. Some struggled to trust. Others muttered that the tribe's presence was a danger waiting to ignite. The farmer, though weary, never wavered. He spent his days walking among them, speaking not with grand speeches but with simple acts, sharing his harvest, guiding their hands to the well, reminding them that water flowed best when it was not hoarded. In the evenings, he often sat with the chief, the two men watching the fire crackle as they spoke of what lay ahead. The chief, weathered by years of loss and survival, warned that peace was a trail as treacherous as war, for it demanded constant tending. The farmer nodded, knowing the truth of it, but he also knew that peace, once kindled, was worth every effort to preserve. For in that peace, children grew without fear of raids, women laughed without shadows in their eyes, and men laid down their rifles to build rather than to burn. What neither the farmer nor the chief could ignore, however, was that beyond the valley, the world remained the same. Conflict still raged, distrust still ruled, and men of power still sought to divide. They knew their sanctuary was fragile, a flame in the wind. But they also knew that what had been built here was proof that in even the harshest corners of the West, kindness could sow roots deep enough to stand against fire. Years slipped by, and the farmer's hair turned the color of ash, his once strong hands slowed by time. Yet his well still flowed, and the bond he had forged still held. He was no longer just a farmer. He was the elder of a valley where tribe and settler lived as kin. To those who came seeking stories, he never boasted, never painted himself as a hero. When asked how it all began, he would smile faintly and point to the well. It started with water, he'd say, and with choosing to give when I could have turned away. The children of the tribe and the settler families grew together, speaking both tongues, carrying both traditions. They sang of ancestors around campfires and plowed fields with hands calloused by labor. In their laughter and their play, the past divisions seemed like distant shadows, fading with each sunrise. For them, the West was not a place of endless conflict but of shared stories and shared soil. They were the living proof of what their elders had fought to create. Travelers who passed through often left with tales that grew into legend. They spoke of a valley where enemies had become brothers, where rifles gathered dust and hands were used to build rather than destroy. Some dismissed the stories as fanciful lies, yet others carried them far, until saloons and towns across the frontier buzzed with whispers of a place where kindness had won. It became a myth, a hope, a spark of what the West might one day become if more men chose to give instead of to take. The farmer, now aged and slower, often sat by his well at twilight, the same spot where it had all begun. He would watch the horizon glow red with the dying sun and think of the stranger who had once staggered into his land, half dead from thirst. That single moment had shaped everything that followed, every bond, every battle, every victory. He realized then that destiny was not written by grand acts of power, but by small choices made in silence, when no one was watching. And so the valley endured, long after his strength faded, long after his voice grew quiet. It endured not because of one man alone, but because his choice to give water had planted something eternal in the hearts of those who followed. In a land as harsh as the West, where cruelty often ruled, the farmer's story became a reminder that kindness, once offered, has the power to outlast generations, turning strangers into family and survival into legacy. In the end, the story of the farmer and his well was not about water at all. It was about choice. In a land where men often measured worth in bullets and fences, he chose to share instead of withhold, to trust instead of fear. That single moment of generosity had rippled outward, turning enemies into allies, strangers into kin, and a lone farmhouse into the heart of a valley that defied the cruelty of the West. His act reminded us that the greatest power lies not in strength of arms, but in the courage to give when it costs us the most. The valley he built with the tribe was proof that kindness could outlast fire, steel, and suspicion. It was not an easy path. There were battles, betrayals, and storms that nearly broke them. But in the end, unity endured where division would have destroyed. What began with one man and one cup of water became a legacy that stretched beyond his lifetime, carried in the laughter of children and the trust between neighbors who once would have stood on opposite sides. And though the farmer himself grew old and faded into the twilight, his story did not end with him. Travelers carried it across the plains, transforming it into a tale that inspired and unsettled in equal measure. To some, it was just a myth, but to those who listened closely, it was a reminder that even in the harshest lands, compassion is the strongest defense. His life asked a question that still lingers today. If one man's kindness could change a valley, what might happen if we dared to do the same? This is the lesson the Old West often hid beneath its dust and blood, that survival is not only about standing tall against hardship, but about leaning on others and allowing them to lean on you. The farmer's well was never just a hole in the ground. It was a symbol, a gathering place, a beacon of what humanity could become when it refused to be consumed by fear. That is why his story endures, not in monuments or books, but in the hearts of those who carry its truth. If this story moved you, let it live on beyond these words. Share in the comments what part of the farmer's journey struck you most, or how his choice to give when it mattered most made you reflect on your own life. And if you want to walk further into the forgotten stories of the Old West, where sacrifice, hope, and resilience shaped legends, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. By doing so, you'll not only keep these tales alive, but become part of their legacy yourself.